The story of Patu is the story of Ngā Taonga. It's one of the first films that was deposited at the archive. It's one of the reasons the archive was created. Back in 2012, we were able to get it on the Memory of the World Register. There's actually multiple versions of this film. There's the original theatrical release, which is what we have preserved here. We generally use what was released theatrically as the master format and the master cut. But what most New Zealanders would have seen would be the TV cut. The filmmakers were very aware that there are different ways to reach different audiences. Seeing something in a cinema, you're going to get a different audience than you would on broadcast TV. So this allowed Patu to reach as many audiences as possible.
Kiwis that are familiar with Patu are more than likely familiar with the television version that has been shown, which is just over an hour long and 25 frames per second, which is a cut down and slightly sped up version of the original release, which was released for film audiences and is just over 2 hours long. So the differences between those two, for me, is obviously that the original intention of the filmmaker, Mera Tamita, is encapsulated in that 2 hour version. That's the film that she originally made. That film it was intended to be seen. So that's the version that we've gone back to. That's the original document.
It really was a film of collaboration. Patu, you've got the main filmmaker on it, but you have all these other people collaborating with her that all put in an immense amount of work. Which means that the film, you can actually see the different styles. Once you've seen it enough times, you can actually start identifying the different camera people or the different sound people even, and their approach to a scene and the shots that they're choosing. So it's a film full of collaboration.
I guess the reason that the film was made this way is probably what these days we call crowdsourcing. The call was put out, obviously the Springbok tour was of huge topical interest to Kiwis and filmmakers, and as the protest movement sprang up around it, lots of filmmakers wanted to document that out of interest because it was going to be, photographers are drawn to dynamic events like protests and stuff. It's fantastic stuff to document. And I think when filmmakers heard that Merita was making this film specifically about the protests, people rallied around and realised that rather than making their own film, they could contribute their footage to her project. Yeah, so you'd have a variety of different cameras, and then you'd have the stocks that people would have access to as well, and that might be ends of reels. Film was quite expensive, so you'd take what you could get really. If you could afford to have a roll of film 1 week, then next week you might not have money, and so you'd have to borrow it, get some stock that somebody can lend you from another source, or if you've got to make that works at a TV studio, maybe you could grab some ends of something that's like leftovers from a project they're making.
There was footage that was brought in from everywhere, and so it was different qualities of shooting, of camera work, different types of film. Often they were just using whatever film they could find. We've learned quite a bit during this process, which is it's been a trial by fire. We have come across types of footage that we had never expected to come across before. So it involved developing new processes and workflows and realizing this isn't going to work this way. So we're going to have to go back and completely revisit how are we going to scan this sort of thing? What are the settings that are used? Are we going to have to use a different source? As you're scanning something that started as analog, you are fundamentally changing the artifact, the object, the experience of it. And so we have to be incredibly careful not to introduce anything through the scanning process.
In film preservation, we go back to the best master material we have available, which in the case of Patu, we were really lucky to have the master negative, which is the film negative that the film was made from.
Patu was shot on 16mm. Now 16mm is one of the smaller formats, and when it's projected, the frames are so close together that if you cut it, you actually see the cut on screen. So instead of cutting a whole bunch of film together, creating an assembled negative that you would create a print from, you actually do something called an A and B roll.
So what you have is you have your A roll and your B roll of the master negative. Every second shot, you would have a shot of negative, and then you would have black, absolute dense black, that the light that you're exposing onto that next generation of film can't get through. So that film remains unexposed. In the B roll, you will have that shot in that section. So you expose the A reel onto your positive, and then you rewind the film and you expose the B roll. So that the end result is that you have all of the shots in the one exposed reel, and that helps to hide any splices in the shot, in the film, and it also allows for you to do things like fades, and it can help with titles and things.
With Patu, it was made under pressure, so they didn't take shortcuts or anything, but some things were a little bit more difficult to figure out, and part of it was this A and B and aligning it perfectly, because if you're out by a frame, it makes a huge difference over the length of the film. So one of the important jobs is you scan each A roll and B roll, including the black and the images and everything, and then you have to carefully align them, which takes a long time. Going shot by shot, making sure everything isn't missing a frame or there's a frame added, which is just as bad. And sometimes they do add a couple frames here and there because they'll have things like fades. So it's quite a process to take something that is inherently analog, like an A and B roll, 16mm, and then transfer it to this digital continuous DPX sequence, which is what we use when we transfer films.
And after that, we had the sound to deal with. And the sound was also very complicated because we didn't have an entire locked off 16mm set mag source. The advantage of which is that that is locked in sync and drives in the same way that a film would drive. Essentially, as long as the machine is in sync, then the sound is in sync. And you have a sync source and it's relatively trustworthy. Unfortunately, we didn't have that for the entire film. We had the optical sound from the original print. If you've ever seen a film print, you have the images in the print and then you can see a little wobbly line. It looks like how you would recognize a sound wave to look. It looks exactly the same, and that passes over a little light. The light is able to convert that into a wave modulation, and somehow by magical science, it turns it into the various sounds that you hear from the soundtrack, which is incredible, but it's not, the fidelity isn't fantastic. Magnetic sound is much higher quality. So the magnetic source, if you can get it, is always the source that you go to. The one source that we had remaining was open reel, so reel to reel, you know, little 8mm 1/4 inch reel to reel. We had that, and that was a backup that they'd made at the time that they did the sound posts on the original Patu film. So it was 24 frames per second, and it sounded great. But in the intervening years, anybody that's digitized reel-to-reel tape will be able to describe painfully wow and flutter, which is the slight stretchiness that you get from tape. If you digitize it twice, you'll find that the two versions are no longer quite in sync. The sync fluctuates ever so slightly. And unfortunately for me, that was the best source. So I had to lay those various versions up next to each other in a non-linear editor, and using the two optical versions that I had, which did have rock solid 24 frames per second sync, I had to just carefully time stretch all of the other versions to match. And then at that point, once I had all of my sources synced, I was able to go through and assess which sources we had for each part and which was the best sounding source. And then I had to cut and select that best source, kind of highlight it, and then eventually drop those into a timeline, assemble them, and then EQ them a little bit and mix them a little bit so that they matched, so that you couldn't hear, as much as possible, you couldn't hear which version was which. Then at that point, went to the incredible Phil Burton from Underground Sound in Wellington, with whom we were able to play that all through crystal clear speakers in a nice space, and double check that there's no glitches, double check that none of those differences are audible, and then do some final tweaks. And that's how we created the soundtrack.